Today we are joined by Linda Dubrow-Marshall, Jennifer French Tomasic, Ashley McLean, and Kate Amber. Linda Dubrow-Marshall is a chair of the Mental Health Committee for ICSA and a member of the ICSA Research Network. She's a co-founder of the Re-Entry Therapy Information and Referral Network, or RETURN, UK, a private practice that provides services to individuals and families who have been affected by cultic influence and abusive relationships. Linda co-developed and co-leads the MSc Psychology of Coercive Control program at the University of Salford, UK. She is registered with the Health and Care Professionals Council, United Kingdom, as both a clinical and counseling psychologist, and she's an accredited counselor and psychotherapist with the British Association for Counseling and Psychotherapy. She's a licensed psychologist in Pennsylvania, USA, and a registered psychologist with the National Register of Health Service Psychologists, USA. Dr. Dubrow-Marshall is a consultant in clinical hypnosis with an advanced certification with the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis and is certified by the Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing Institute. She is certified as a master addiction counselor with the National Certification Commission for Addiction Professionals. Kate Amber, MSc, is the founder and visionary at End Coercive Control USA, or ICSA, and is a beacon of change in the landscapes of domestic abuse and coercive control. As an international speaker, consultant, researcher, and expert witness, she harnesses her personal experience and academic expertise to educate and revolutionize systems, restoring dignity and freedom to survivors. With a master's degree in the psychology of coercive control from the University of Salford and an advanced certification in violence and abuse prevention from the University of Pennsylvania and child protection from the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma, she merges lived experience with a strong academic foundation. Her groundbreaking research, including the Quicksand Model of coercive control, has won her acclaim, notably the 2024 Domestic Violence Training Program of the Year Award from DomesticShelters.org. Jennifer French Tomasic is a cult and religious recovery specialist and a survivor herself. She offers group and individual services both within the U.S. and internationally. Jennifer holds a master's in the psychology of coercive control and is currently pursuing her PhD in forensic victimology. She is trauma trained and a level 2 internal family systems practitioner. Jennifer hosts the Project Hope podcast for families and friends with loved ones in a high control or high demand group. She is a member of the International Cultic Studies Association's Research Committee and has conducted research on those who self-identify as having experienced coercive control and received internal family systems therapy as a result. Jennifer is also an expert witness in coercive control court cases. She lives in Los Angeles, California with her husband and extended family. Ashley McLean is a former member of NXIVM and a graduate of the MSc Psychology of Coercive Control program at the University of Salford in the UK. Her research interests include the recovery processes of former members and a psychological malpractice engaged in by pseudo-therapeutic groups. Thank you for joining us, and welcome Linda, Kate, Jennifer, and Ashley.
Hello, and welcome everyone to our panel discussion today on research and practice-based recommendations for mental health interventions for cult survivors and their families. And we're really pleased that you've taken the time to join us today. And our speakers today are myself, Linda Dubrow-Marshall, and I'm co-program leader of the MSc Psychology of Coercive Control program at the University of Salford, along with Rod Dubrow-Marshall. And I'm a clinical and counseling psychologist, and my private practice that deals with coercive control and cults is called Return UK. And I'm really proud today to have 3 of the graduates of our MSc program. So Ashley, if you want to just say hi. Ashley McLean. Hello. And she's a child and family services professional who supports survivors of acute and complex trauma, graduated our program in 2019. So you get to go first. Followed by Kate Amber. Hi, Kate.
Hi.
2022 graduate, founder, and Chief Visionary Officer of End Coercive Control USA and creator of the Quicksand Model. And finally, Jennifer French Tomasic, and I think we left out one of your names, Jennifer. Did we? No, I think that's it. MS graduate 2022. Want to wave. And Jennifer is a cult religious recovery specialist and an integrative trauma coach. So just to let you know, so we are all from the MSc Psychology Coercive Control program at the University of Salford, which is a fully online or distance learning program. 1 year for full-time students and 2 years for part-time students. We're happy to give you more information about that. And today, we're stressing the importance of getting guidance on mental health interventions from research and practice. So Ashley, Kate, and Jennifer are presenting aspects of their master's dissertation research. Ashley on unpacking discourse, analyzing organizational structures and adverse effects on their population. So she did a discourse analysis. Kate on the Quicksand Model of coercive control, where she built a model and tested it using mixed methods. So we use a variety of research methods in our program. And Jennifer explored the therapeutic experiences of internal family systems therapy clients who identified themselves as having experienced coercive control. And she did a qualitative study, interpretive phenomenological analysis. And in the end, I'm going to read some suggestions from the return model of recovery. So I'm going to turn over to you now, Ashley.
Right. Thank you very much for having me. And I'm going to talk about my research that I did in 2019. I have here 2020, but that was the graduation ceremony and COVID took over. So, okay. So right now I do work in child and family services with families and children who've gone through ACE level trauma and work on the recovery aspect of that. So moving forward, I'm going to take you through my presentation. Oops, here we go. So we'll be looking at practical approaches of how critical discourse analysis and Foucauldian discourse analysis has worked with a research method and how it can support cult victims. I'm going to take you through my research objectives and look at how language operates as ideological influences within high demand and unregulated contexts using NXIVM as my case study. And then I will take you through a few of the critical discourse analysis theories. So I think it's valuable to understand that these mechanisms are really helpful when supporting former members, as it validates their experience and helps to dismantle shame and confusion often associated with post-cult recovery. Because there's so much ideology, I also hope that this can really support sort of literacy for victim support, legal reform, and public awareness, and become crucial in addressing harm in unregulated spaces. So there's just so much coming out of it. And in the online world, there's even more. So I think that there's really a lot of use for this research as a method. Moving forward, let's see. So when we look at industries like life coaching and wellness retreats or certain spiritual organizations, after coaching within those spiritual organizations, we see a disturbing trend where people with power operating without oversight. So, and from there, we've got enforceable standards of care with individuals or groups crossing ethical boundaries, sometimes unknowingly and other times intentionally. So that was what this research really looks into, is can we see through some of their early on text documents, what do this critical discourse reveal? And so survivors are often left with nowhere to go, nowhere really to report to. And that's what I wanted to kind of review with this research. So moving on. So examining these therapeutic documents of an unregulated organization, in this case, NXIVM, I wanted to see how there was psychological misconduct in the early phases and how an unnoticed and the effects of its closed system population. So Foucault describes power as not merely as repressive and only hierarchical, but as productive and kind of diffused, embedded in the discourse and the dialogue and organizational rules and social practices that shape individuals' subjectivities and choices. So in these cultic environments, they operate these kind of subjectivities or discourses. They operate through normalization, and they're how we behave and how we kind of perceive morality. So essentially, we want to look at how this has been internalized in closed group systems. And I think there's also future research. You can look at a lot more dense text. But right now, this was just a very small section to just look for basic misconduct. So when I was picking the methodology, I really looked at critical discourse analysis and Foucauldian discourse analysis. And the more I work on this from 2019 to now, I bring a lot more critical discourse into it, which you'll see. I've spoken at the ABAI and discussed complex behaviors in this regard. And I think it explains power better. So critical discourse analysis is very text focused, and I used those stepping stones because Foucault as a system was much more vague, but I liked his concepts on power and how he breaks down power. So what I did is I took those and used them through the critical discourse lens, which they also used Foucault. This wasn't grounded theory. This was based on critical discourse to really look at the linguistic analysis because I had the text documents that were public access. So okay, here we go. Let's see. So here we go. We look at Foucault again. So power, knowledge, and subject formation versus critical discourse really looks at like the ideology and the social inequalities that may come up. And then I also brought in principles of influence because I wanted to look at the psychological mechanisms of persuasion of how individuals were perhaps persuaded in specific situations. And I do come from a marketing background prior to during my master's degree. So I did find this very interesting to really look at like how I myself was kind of conned and accepted these things as truths. And then from there, the results talk about like, can we find patterns of coercion? Can we call it coercion within these practices? See here. Okay. So really understanding the ways groups like NXIVM and similar therapeutic groups construct these ideological frameworks, it's productive because these groups often present themselves as offering truth or solutions, which we all are very aware of. But by analyzing their discourse, we can better identify how ideologies are built to control and influence people's actions, beliefs, and identities on a spectrum of control. So maybe not everyone coming out of these groups will have the same experience. However, with NXIVM, my research was based on the course material, and I wanted to analyze for strategies and concepts that could lead to harm from day one. A lot of people had said, no, these are good therapeutic like techniques. And from my experience, I want to say, no, these were all influenced by the leader from the hierarchy. So this type of research allows to critically assess the ideas and organizations that claim to have these answers and hopefully have a real world impact in providing another avenue for victim support in legal frameworks and avenues. So looking at these processes, I looked at the micro and macro power strategies and structures in emerging discourses relating to the development of power dynamics and social influences within the group. So in each document, I used the mission statements, probably the best if you're going to look up one of these to just kind of verify how I've done some of this work. So you look at identity, identifying the subjects, identifying objects, analyzing language for subject and object relationships, and examining the power in between those relationships. So it's very dense, but you'll start to see how this stuff begins to form. Let's see. So, and how things normalize. And this is what I mean by subject formation. It creates a subject who's not enough as they are and needs help in the context of NXIVM. So they created this knowledge and power discourse on growth and truth. But if we're looking at Foucault and you're going, okay, well, there's power everywhere. It's true, there is. But we're also looking here at a broader scope of an ideology that may or may not be coercive. So sometimes in hospitals, and we want associations with regulations, that's normal and we show up in a certain way. We have places to kind of go. So let me see here. Let me take you through. So this is a wider context of my presentation, and I've taken critical discourse analysis through separating them into different chunks. So looking at like the development of discourse, looking at like the historical transformations over time, and then we can also go look at how it's been utilized within the structure of the ideology. So how NXIVM used their therapeutic techniques, and then a lot of social impact. So because this was such a closed system group, there were some very interesting frameworks that were sort of revealed, as you can see in my results. The normalization and it normalizes and enables behaviors such as compliance and conformity to an idea, in this case, ideology, and how individual agency can be affected by social pressures. I'll quickly run you through genealogical analysis, archaeological analysis, and governmentality. So these are kind of frames of reference for how to assess power in various formats. You can do this in 9 different ways, and really looking at like how power is dispersed, how we surveil ourselves and each other, and through NXIVM's technology. There was a lot of that. Let me see here. So social proof kind of reinforced the norms of signaling a consensus that equates to correctness. So, well, let's see. So the principle of commitment, which was one of the therapeutic techniques, begins the process of kind of an identity fusion to the group through incremental investments. So that then you combined these concepts with something like learned helplessness, where you needed to then be kind of to become moral or ethical or whatever you needed to be. You had to begin to rely on each different process of the courses. So let's see. So I want to look at also, I think we should be teaching too, so this brings Cialdini into it, teaching about specific kinds of mechanisms that interrupt this ability to kind of think critically. And the antithesis of this was NXIVM really went, no, we're teaching people to think critically. And I'm saying, no, actually, you weren't teaching people to think critically. And eventually you can read my article so I can explain this in a much clearer way. So let's see here. So I want to talk about how some of these fallacies were not merely accidental lapses once we look at how the structure and power goes through, but functioning as sort of an ideologically motivated linguistic tool deliberately embedded within NXIVM discourses, as you can see here. So I want to talk about cognitive distortions in this way. And these fallacies. So by preventing these, something like a false dilemma, they appeal to authority and other flaws, which argument is sound logic. NXIVM constructed a reality in which obedience appeared intellectually justified, and dissent appeared irrational or emotionally unbalanced. This strategic misuse of language created an epistemological framework. So that's another overarching discourse that came out of it, was the epistemological aspects of NXIVM, and where these organizations' authorities kind of were protected. So if you couldn't, so they would use these different kind of thinking traps to say, no, look, like I get that your answer is good, but then that's not ethical in that term. So let's see here. What else do we have? So CDA ultimately highlights how these distortions and fallacies are not incidental, but deeply embedded in the discursive structures of power. So within NXIVM, language operated as a mechanism of social control, shaping what could be said, felt, and thought. Discourses around growth and empowerment and personal responsibility were ideologically loaded, masking a lot of surveillance and coercion and exploitation beneath the surfaces of self-help rhetoric. So we want to reframe cognitive distortions and logical fallacies as institutionally reinforced discourses. And this critical discourse analysis really reveals how languages in XEM functioned to normalize these systems and suppress any dissent. So that was the basis of my literature review there. Okay. And that is the end of that aspect.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Fascinating. And the use of language and the way you studied the text just yielded so much insight into how the influence was inappropriately yielded. So thank you so much for discussing your research. It was so interesting. Next up will be Kate. Jennifer, you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, Ashley, this is so fascinating that you've created kind of a whole framework by which one can evaluate an organization, or I would assume a program of some sort, that it is providing what it should provide. And I wondered if you had considered, or what your thoughts might be about applying something like this to, say, the troubled teen industry, where we're seeing programs that are extremely unhealthy, and really kind of bringing that to the surface. Is this something, kind of a lens or a framework, that we could look through to evaluate a program like that?
Definitely. I think there's so much use for this. I've also looked at it with when you've had a democracy in a country that then becomes a dictatorship. We've looked at it from like those sort of government stances. But really, like, I work in child services, and there's a lot of unions, but the unions are for like construction workers. So they don't understand healthcare. There's a lot of unregulation, and so even though these are government funded contractors, what I tend to find is there's people who have very little experience in this field. They maybe have one or two small courses on, it's a company thing on trauma, which is fine. But then you've got people with master's degrees and doctors who are under them because of seniority systems. So it doesn't necessarily matter who's got education if somebody running the program doesn't understand what behavioral analysis is, or some of these, I guess, concepts. I mean, yes, we've got many, many government programs that should be aware of them, but yeah, the troubled teen industry is such a challenge and has to be talked about. I think it's something that's just got to continue making it to the public surface in the media.
Thank you for the interesting question and the fantastic comprehensive answer. And I hope that someone does continue with that research. Thank you again.
Thanks.
And now we're going to hear from Kate Amber about the Quicksand Model of coercive control. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Linda. So hi, everybody. My name is Kate Amber, and I am a survivor. I have survived not once, but several times, the most devastating and dangerous form of abuse, coercive control. And maybe you have too and don't even know it yet. My journey of uncovering coercive control led me to researching the topic, create the Quicksand Model training, obtain an advanced degree, and ultimately found a company called End Coercive Control USA, which is dedicated to detecting and preventing coercive control so that others won't have to suffer as my children and I have. Some quick housekeeping. For first, some of the content here may be triggering, so please take care of yourself during and after the presentation. And second, I will often use the term target instead of victim. I do so to avoid blaming those harmed and to keep accountability focused on those responsible, the coercive controllers. So, what is coercive control? Well, I define coercive control as the pattern of behavior that entraps targets in domination and oppression. Coercive control can happen anywhere people are willing and able to abuse their power. Coercive control is not a single tactic or incident. It is a pattern of abusive tactics and strategies that rob the target of their dignity, liberty, safety, autonomy, and freedom, and it may or may not include physical violence. The impacts of coercive control tactics, even when seemingly minor, add up. This cumulative effect can be so dehumanizing that it can be fatal. I will start with a snippet from my own experience. I was born to an entitled and dominating father who used physical and non-physical coercive control against my mother, his target. They divorced when I was 4, but his abuse didn't stop. My father picketed the church and the courthouse to humiliate and punish my mother for daring to leave him. When she remarried, his abuse escalated, which is extremely common for coercive controllers. At the age of 7, my father kidnapped my brother and I to Australia, interfering with our most important attachment relationship with our mother. This post-separation abuse, which is often overlooked by professionals and courts, kept us in danger, isolated us from support, and increased our risks of psychological and physical harm. Upon returning to the U.S., I was physically, spiritually, and sexually abused by our stepfather. My stepdad blamed me. Once, when I tried to stand up to his coercive control, he pointed his finger at me and he shouted, "Devil, be gone! I rebuke you in Jesus' name." Weaponizing my mother's religion confused her and prevented her from helping me. Middle school left scars from bullying, victim blaming, and false accusations. At 18, mom and stepdad moved out of state, took my little brother with them, and left me to finance my own college degree while they were trained to indoctrinate strangers into their religious ideology. Early coercive control groomed me for future abuse. I was raped at 17 by a boss and date raped at 18. I didn't report these crimes because I'd been groomed to believe I was at fault. After spending my entire life trying to fix what abusers claimed was wrong with me, I now realize it wasn't me at all. And if you have been or are being abused by a coercive controller, you are not to blame either. Coercive control is extremely harmful and dangerous. We know this from research. For example, research on adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs. Even one ACE can have a significant lifelong impact on a target's physical, emotional, and mental health. Hundreds of thousands of cases were studied and uncovered 10 ACEs, which include physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, emotional and physical neglect, and 5 types of household dysfunction. Each ACE increases a person's risks exponentially. What do ACEs have to do with coercive control? Remember, coercive control is a pattern of combined abuses. So coercive control, just like ACEs, exponentially increases lifetime risks for everything pictured here. Behavioral risks include things like missed work, smoking, and substance use. Physical health impacts include the top 10 causes of death, like heart disease, cancer, and stroke. The trauma from coercive control increases your risk for nearly all chronic, mental, and physical disease. Reflecting on my childhood, I received 1 ACE for household mental illness, another for my mother being treated violently, my parents' divorce, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect. In total, my ACE score was 7. But then new research added bullying, and my score increased to 8. Coercive control interfered with my brain development, trained me to cope in harmful ways, and left me unprotected from future predators. When I was 21, my father forced me on a trip to Mexico, where he plied me with alcohol and sent me home with a stranger. Crimes of alcohol facilitated sexual assault and human trafficking. In adult relationships, I was targeted by coercive controllers and experienced physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. As I learned the signs of abuse, each subsequent coercive controller was more deceptive and covert than the last one, and eventually, my life was completely ripped apart by a dangerous, sadistic con artist who set me up to look like the perpetrator. He convinced police, prosecutors, attorneys, judges, CPS, therapists, family, friends, colleagues, even some domestic violence services to turn against me. The consequences were severe. The systems meant to protect me failed me and my kids. I lost my business, home, health, relationships, even my parental rights. And it was during this extremely dark time that my childhood trauma escalated to severe, complex traumatic stress. I developed migraines, crippling back pain, extreme hormonal dysfunction, panic attacks, flashbacks, nightmares, dissociation, and became suicidal. One night, I awoke from a nightmare with my heart and mind racing. I could feel the weight of my children's well-being on my back, and I could see their bright futures fading away. I felt silenced and humiliated, dragged down by false assumptions, biases, and uneducated professionals. I was frozen and felt like I was drowning, suffocating, and sinking deeper and deeper into inescapable terror. Me and my kids were trapped in quicksand. In the midst of excruciating pain, I had a moment of clarity, and the result was the Quicksand Model. The Quicksand Model, on which I conducted my master's degree research and dissertation, combines images, alliterations, and the metaphor of quicksand to quickly train professionals on coercive control from the perspective of an entrapped target. My research shows the model transcends domestic violence, cults, human trafficking, gangs, and extremism. Anywhere power can be abused. It is trauma-informed, domestic abuse, and coercive control informed. My research indicates that the Quicksand Model validates survivors, reduces victim blaming, and focuses accountability on the coercive controllers. Participants in the study, both survivors of individuals and of groups, as well as professionals in this field, indicated that they felt more educated, empowered, and motivated to transform systems after engaging with the Quicksand Model videos. My hope is that the Quicksand Model will empower professionals to transform policies and enable entrapped targets to finally escape. Today, I'll give you a taste of the model as a way for therapists and other professionals to empathize with and appreciate the barriers that targeted victims of coercive control face, and to help inform the psychoeducation you might provide clients who have been entrapped in the quicksand of coercive control. Despite available resources, our systems are failing to stop violence and abuse. Why? Because we are all siloed. We need to use systems thinking and reveal that all types of violence and abuse are interconnected through coercive control. To end violence and abuse, we must recognize that coercive controllers are everywhere. Just like the ones pictured here, their abuse spans domestic violence, child abuse, trafficking, gangs, institutional violence, cults, serial killers, workplace violence, and even religion. All of these predators use coercive control, and if we want to stop them, we must remove the causes. But what causes coercive control? Two main things cause coercive control: coercive controllers and the people and systems that enable them. Starting with systems, there's the key of socialization, which welds together supremacy, misogyny, and harmful cultural norms. Supremacy teaches that some people are more valuable than other people. Misogyny teaches that non-compliance by those less valuable people deserve punishment. And harmful norms are woven throughout our cultures and social systems, training us to believe that some forms of abuse are justified. Each person gets their social key as we grow up in our families, churches, communities, and schools. This social grooming makes us vulnerable to exploitation by savvy coercive controllers. Hierarchies are all about supremacy and misogyny, exploiting and punishing those at the bottom to keep the top in power. All forms of supremacy, oppression, including racism, sexism, ableism, and all other isms, not only cause coercive control, but enable it to escalate. Ideologies or belief systems also open the door to coercive controllers. Like colored glasses, our beliefs color our perceptions and allow coercive control to sneak past our critical thinking and cause us to behave in ways we normally wouldn't. For example, family courts, influenced by sexist ideologies like parental alienation theory, often fail to protect victims of domestic abuse during custody decisions. These ideologies unfairly blame victims and unfairly advantage coercive controllers. By removing ideological glasses, judges, for instance, will be able to see the coercive controlling behavior clearly and hopefully enhance protection for targets and their kids. Coercive controllers also target our psychological, social, and biological needs. And until we learn what makes each of us individually vulnerable, coercive controllers will have free rein to coerce and control us. Especially savvy coercive controllers target all three areas, hitting the bullseye. So how do coercive controllers go about entrapping their targets in quicksand of coercive control? Well, they create a mirage. They use three main tactics to create an illusion, and this mirage lowers their target's resistance, establishes false rapport, and activates their emotions, reducing their critical thinking. Manipulative kindness, also known as love bombing, makes the target feel like they have met their soulmate. Mirroring their target's beliefs, values, and mannerisms makes the target feel aligned with the coercive controller and their goals. And future faking activates the target's desire to create a perfect, beautiful future together. The coercive controller's mirage hides the dangerous quicksand and its warning signs in the background. Once mesmerized, the D's, E's, and F's begin and start to erode the target's autonomy and freedom. The mirage fools targets and outsiders to believe that the coercive controllers have good intentions when they do not. Coercive controllers always have a hidden agenda to dominate and oppress. So even when they seem kind, loving, and genuinely helpful, it's all a smokescreen. It is all a mirage. This is why practically every news story of an abuser killing his entire family includes statements from shocked neighbors and friends, calling him a great guy or a wonderful father, because all they saw was the mirage. They didn't see the coercive control hiding behind closed doors. They never saw the dangerous quicksand hiding in the background until it was too late. Let's look at how the coercive controllers use the D's, E's, and F's to entrap and exploit their targets. The D's represent the weapons of coercive control, also known as the doubles and Darvo. Although all the weapons are harmful, three are particularly damaging, not just to direct targets, but also to their families and communities: double speak, double team, and double binds, which I'll cover in a moment. The F's are the methods of coercive control: force, fraud, and fear. Now, most people equate domestic violence, especially, with physical violence. But as you can see from this quicksand model image, force is only the tip of the iceberg, and there is always a lot more hiding below the surface of the quicksand. To make that hidden coercive control visible, we must learn to identify the tactics of fear and fraud as well, which are more subtle and easier to miss. So when combined, the D's and F's achieve the coercive controller's goals. The E's. Coercive control is purposeful, instrumental, and intentional. And coercive controllers have goals to ensnare, entrap, exploit, enslave, and prevent their target's escape through escalation, all while evading accountability. They want a slave for life. So if their target escapes, they may escalate to erase and eradicate where homicide and suicide risks increase. So let's look at those three doubles and see how coercive controllers meet their goals. Doublespeak weaponizes communication. Coercive controllers use all manner of manipulative and deceptive communication to confuse, frustrate, punish, and provoke their targets. These psychological manipulations, especially gaslighting, where the coercive controller sadistically drives their target crazy, can do an extraordinary amount of damage over time, including severe harm like PTSD, CPTSD, dissociation, identity disturbances, and even death. Double team weaponizes social support. Coercive controllers fracture relationships, isolate targets from support, and turn people against each other. They prevent targets from accessing medical and mental health care. They interfere with access to their children. They ruin relationships and interfere with their target's income, career, education, and more. And double binds weaponize a person's agency and choice. Coercive controllers set their targets up, forcing them into choices with only bad outcomes. They demand co-parenting, but refuse to co-parent themselves, a double standard, which makes the target parent appear hostile to the system. Targets are forced to choose between things like obtaining a protective order, which could isolate the coercive controller, or not doing so and facing constant stalking. Or they must choose between living with an abuser or divorcing them under a credible threat of losing custody of their kids. And every single decision they make while being forced to co-parent with a coercive controller because the court has ordered them to do so becomes another double bind where targets are expected to comply with unreasonable demands or suffer punishment for failing to do so. Not complying with a court order could result in jail, but not complying with the coercive controller could result in death. Two last things are important to understand: character and context. First, character. Coercive controllers lack moral character. They employ deception, manipulation, and strategic coercion to entrap their targets on purpose. They also use the same tactics against anyone helping to try to help the target escape. So don't be fooled. If you learn their weapons, the Ds, their methods, the Fs, and their goals, the Es, you can avoid being used by them to harm someone else. And finally, with coercive control, context is king. Coercive controllers will try to fool you by removing context. This image illustrates the same action with two very different contexts. When the man slaps the woman, he does so to punish her for not tidying up the kitchen as he demanded. Conversely, she slaps him to escape his punishment and protect the baby. Context matters. Why? Because a slap to dominate is very different from a defensive one. Coercive controllers intentionally exclude context so that they can flip the script. So it's important to ask lots of questions and understand the full context to avoid being tricked by a coercive controller posing as a victim. It's also really important to compassionately support victims who have acted aggressively to defend themselves or others. Acts of self-defense do not qualify as coercive control. Self-defense is an act of resistance and should be applauded and not punished. Millions of targets of coercive control are metaphorically drowning in quicksand, silenced and bound, trying to protect their children while sinking deeper and deeper, dragged down by professionals' failure to recognize coercive control and the devastating harms it causes. By identifying coercive controllers, applying the appropriate context, and removing barriers to escape, targets may finally be able to break free and heal. But helping targets escape is not enough. We must also dismantle systems rooted in supremacy, misogyny, and oppression, and replace them with systems valuing equality, safety, dignity, and freedom for all. Thank you for your time and attention, and please feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Kate, for first of all, for sharing your story, which was awful but motivated, such a wonderful model, a great example of post-traumatic growth if I've ever seen one. Also would like to say that you had some discourse analysis in there.
Oh, cool.
But see, you look at the use of language, you've reframed victims to targets. You talked about double speak, double binds. So without realizing it, you really were looking at the very important role of language as well, which was really interesting. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we'll turn over to you, Jennifer, to learn about your fascinating research on internal family systems and its application for survivors of coercive control.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Of course, I do wish I was with you all live. Just so you have a little idea of who I am and my qualifications, I'm Jennifer. My business is Jennifer French, LLC. So we're here to discuss some of the research findings based on the body of work that I was able to engage with through my master's program at Salford University. And some of you will also be familiar with my advisors, Dr. Linda and Rod Dubrow-Marshall. So some of you will also note that my image references to the Inside Out movie. In IFS, we sometimes use this animated film to help people understand parts. The film is about a little girl with the images you will see representing her feelings. And all other images are taken from a Conscious Stories book for children called The Hug Who Got Stuck. So the title and topic of my research is exploring the therapeutic experience of internal family systems therapy, clients who have self-identified as experiencing coercive control, a qualitative study. And let's begin with the rationale of the research and some foundational understanding around coercive control, which certainly Kate has already introduced us to. So the UK implemented coercive control legislation as a part of its Serious Crimes Act of 2015, making it a crime. Coercive control is a strategic pattern of behavior designed to exploit, control, create dependency, and dominate. Initially, the victim may be drawn into the relationship with love bombing and charm. Gaslighting, isolation, economic control, and financial abuse can take place alongside rules and regulations that are gradually introduced over time and change at the whim of the abuser. The victim knows there are consequences if rules are broken, and they apply to the victim rather than the perpetrator, creating a double standard. Over time, coercively controlling behavior erodes the victim's sense of self, their confidence, self-esteem, agency, and autonomy. Many factors play a role in the impact of this type of psychological abuse has on the individual. And as a result, not all individuals who have experienced coercive control will have the same symptoms. We do know, however, that symptoms typically fall into a trauma diagnosis to varying degrees. As noted in this slide, this is a social issue and societal issue and concern as well. This term, coercive control, rose to popularity through the work of Evan Stark, who is focused through a domestic partner lens. What's interesting is that this type of manipulation, again, as Kate and Ashley have already expressed, takes place not only within a one-to-one abusive relationship, but we are also able to identify examples of coercive control being used in gangs, sex trafficking, and cults or high control groups. The impact of coercive control often results in symptoms of PTSD or CPTSD, and that's complex post-traumatic stress disorder. All of the 8 participants in this study had experienced extreme forms of coercive control, ranging from what they would identify as harmful religious experiences to abusive intimate relationships, to abuse within families, to sex trafficking and ritualistic abuse. 5 of the 8 reported dissociation and all reported depression. I also wanted to acknowledge here that coercive control and its impact will most often extend beyond the individual to impact their families, their decision-making, and their lived experience of the world. When I considered the variety of experiences and contexts of coercive control, along with individual differences, I wondered what therapeutic approaches that exist that could already be effective with this demographic, including therapies aimed at treating trauma. I'm very familiar with IFS, also referred to as internal family systems, and I use it both personally and with clients. It plays a large role in my practice and is somewhat of a lens through which I approach my understanding of people. This model has never been studied in relation to survivors of coercive control, and the theoretical basis for IFS would appear to have applicability to the treatment of survivors of coercive control. So a little about IFS. A few foundational elements in understanding IFS include the principle that our psyches are made up of different parts, sometimes called subpersonalities. Each part has its own perspective, feelings, memories, goals, and motivations. Richard Schwartz, PhD, in developing the IFS method, discovered that every part has a positive intent, no matter how problematic its behavior. We find that when individuals truly understand the intent of each part, the rationale for their behaviors, feelings, and attitudes, they begin to heal. Since coercive control typically results in the creation of some level of shame or disconnection from oneself, this form of compassion-based relating found in IFS could be helpful. In addition, an IFS therapist truly welcomes all parts of a client and approaches all parts with respect. In doing so, clients often deepen in their own respect for parts of themselves. This style may also help them feel respected and safe with the therapist, which can be a challenge for survivors of coercive control as they have been manipulated by others. IFS is also permission-based, and parts are consulted before moving on or before working with other parts. This respectful maneuvering with a client could also be particularly important for those who have been violated by others or found themselves dominated by another. In IFS, a central tenet to healing is the concept of self. It's defined as an innate presence in each of us that promotes balance, harmony, and non-judgmental qualities. So in IFS, we talk a lot about the C's: curiosity, caring, creativity, courage, calm, connectedness, clarity, and compassion. An individual who has experienced coercive control often struggles with issues surrounding self-identity due to the part of them that is changed by the influence of another person or group or philosophy. Also, just wanted to say a little something about IFS and trauma. So Frank Anderson, who is kind of in the leadership of trauma around IFS and studies around that, I believe. He believes that IFS has a unique way of addressing and dealing with trauma. He states that it is, quote, the most complete model he has come across to date, and he explains that IFS addresses the cognitive by addressing and unloading distorted thoughts and beliefs. It incorporates the body as it supports the movement and discharge of physical sensations. And it facilitates the release of painful feelings, such as unworthiness, loneliness, and unlovability, by healing the wounds that parts of us carry. IFS helps release parts from their extreme roles and repairs that which has been broken between parts and the self as a result of the trauma. Parts are then able to restore trust in self-leadership and integrate back into the whole system. As part of the methodology that I used, we looked at emerging themes between participants. So these themes are not all inclusive, but rather the most prevalent ones that arose in the research. The first superordinate theme began to unfold a deep understanding of the lived experience and the resulting impact of coercive control upon participants. The second addresses the impact of IFS therapy on symptoms of coercive control. As I move into describing some of the findings, you'll hear me refer to participants with a number and a P indicating participant. Exploring the overarching theme. The impact of coercive control on participants, a notable sub-theme emerged, shared by all participants, was their direct or indirect references to the all-encompassing experience of the coercive control. If this was not expressed directly, it was often implied. For example, P1, who was born and raised in a fundamentalist religious environment, might qualify as having an all-encompassing experience due to his psychological entrapment and the impacted major life decisions that he continued to be affected by. P2 also describes psychological entrapment within his JW, Jehovah's Witness environment, as he describes leaving but maintaining total belief for 18 more years while outside of the environment. P3 refers to the, quote, total life control she experienced. P8 shares, coercive control is pretty intense when you look at it closely, sort of like makes you question everything, end quote. P7's main challenge included struggling to leave her husband and might be viewed as all-encompassing as she lived in this cycle for over 45 years. P8 shares how she is plagued by symptoms that have existed for most of her life. This sense of continued impact speaks to the insidious nature of coercive control and the deep impact it can have on one's psyche and life. The personal symptoms that each individual speaks to can be seen as expressions of the impacts of coercive control. As an individual discovers, heals, and unravels coercion in different ways and at varying paces. In certain instances, it is the emergence of the symptoms themselves that awaken the individual to the abuse they experienced, as is the case with P3, P4, P6, and P8. Another subtheme that emerged in the category of the impact of coercive control was the lived experience of coercive control on perception of self. All participants reflected on the impact that it had on their own perception of themselves. The depth and significance of this dovetails with the initial theme of how all-encompassing it is. For each participant, whether their dominant impact theme is related to psychology, life decisions, living with symptoms, or all of the above, the data also captures a consistency regarding the negative impact on one's perception of self. The extent of this is revealed in moments when one is unable to access their own inner power or sense of themselves. Sometimes this is due to an identification with a religion or family environment, such as is described by P2 when he shares, quote, I truly believed it, and it became part of my identity. This is a Jehovah's Witness. And it's part of who I am. And you know, that now has resulted on serious emotional trauma for which I am receiving therapy in the form of IFS. The indication with or internalization of certain messages have an impact that have long-lasting effects, often beyond leaving the environment in which it took place. P3, for example, states, quote, and to this day, I internalize that belief. And to this day, I'm still unraveling the fact that all the things I was doing weren't this horrendous evil. These comments seem to represent the profound impact on one's sense of self at a core and foundational level. The data also reveals moments when an individual's authentic self seems to emerge from within to rise up against extraordinary pressures or milieu of the coercion. It is perhaps these moments that prove insight into the resiliency of self or the permanence of a nature that is unique to each individual and can be sensed as separate from others and their agendas. Perhaps this reveals a clue into what's most critical for one's healing and thriving. That is, the reparation of one's sense of self as good and worthy of life. Exploring our second overarching theme regarding the impact of IFS on coercive control. The dominant emerging themes were overwhelmingly positive. In the theme that explores this impact on symptoms, the range of positive impacts reported are impressive. Exploring physical symptoms, the impacts vary from positive shifts, as seen with P2, to the complete healing of serious physical symptoms, as seen with P6. For those who experience physical changes with their IFS work, the tangibility of the experience seems to also create trust in the therapeutic model. Participants described particular IFS processes that provide them with a sense of empowerment, knowing they can use IFS as a tool, something they can rely on or access. And participants also referred to their IFS experiences having reduced shame or self-blame. Another theme that arose was participant appreciation for particular elements of IFS, such as the principle of unburdening. Examples of the impact of this process are shared by P1 and P6. However, throughout the interviews, almost all participants shared an experience and appreciation of this principle without using the terminology. In IFS, unburdening refers to the release of emotions that parts may carry, such as long-held shame. Another theme that emerged was the notable use of terminologies such as untangling or unraveling to describe the effect that IFS was having on understanding their inner world and the effects of coercion. This seems to indicate just how intertwined the internalization of coercive messages can become with oneself. Perhaps it's also indicative of the untangling leading to a return to oneself. The last two emerging themes are significant when viewed together. Both seem to indicate a deep and powerful impact of IFS on the individual and their lives. Participants describe having a view of who they were before IFS and after IFS, indicating a dramatic shift. Similarly, a theme emerged for certain participants who had extreme parts, where they acknowledged IFS as possibly having saved their lives. This is also implied by participants who had parts that were suicidal and no longer are. The impact of IFS on sense of self. This theme revealed a range of ways in which IFS seemed to provide all participants with the sense of returning to oneself, accompanied by a sense that it was possible to do so. P2, P5, and P6 described making better decisions from a place that is authentic and connected. P5 describes a deepening trust in herself. And P7 describes a hope she has for a positive shift in self-esteem. For those who have experienced coercive control as having stolen a locus of control from them, this study seems to reveal that IFS is not simply helping participants to reconnect with themselves, but to also untangle coercion and the impact it's had on their lives. In addition, participants seem to all share the sense that IFS is a reliable tool that can continue to help provide hope and empower further changes. And these shared impacts and changes are perhaps best kept in mind alongside the detrimental impact of their coercive control experiences in order to hold a dynamic and multifaceted appreciation of just how significant the impacts have been. So I now have a few quotes from the participants that I would like to share. This is from P5. Yeah, I would say what IFS does, or how it helped me, is it helped me to trust in myself and to trust in my gut and to trust in my intuition and to undo a lot of what a system had done to harm and to control. And so it taught me to have confidence, right? And clarity and all of those C words, and to walk within that and to stand strong. I think first, this is P3, what it is, what it, meaning IFS, unraveled for me again was like anxiety disorder. Yeah, and I mean like truly like unraveled it, which is crazy to me. I feel like in terms of unraveling the coercive trauma and the cult trauma and stuff like that, I'm still really sorting that out. I'm still in process with that. I think what it's doing for me right now is helping me to like lots of things, understanding the perpetrators of that coercion, understanding their higher selves, being able to talk with and discuss with the parts of me that are still carrying those like untruths. And this is P2. I'm not going to say that I have not had panic attacks in the last year, but they have not been as severe as they used to be. Also, hey, the elephant in the room. I am no longer suicidal. I am not contemplating suicide. And that is big. I live on a 10th floor. I am pointing outside because there's a window right there. And there's the balcony from which I had ambition, suicidal ideations, jumping off the 10th floor. And I would stand on the balcony and look down, and I still look down, but I'm taking fresh air, and I'm no longer contemplating jumping, and that is real. And I said, it sure is. Then he said, I think that is progress. And I said, amazing progress. I always would tell people if they had met me before my IFS days and seen me now, and then they'd be like, I don't see that that's the same person kind of thing. Like I went from being really super shy and withdrawn and couldn't look at myself in the mirror and can't look at other people in their face. So I went from that to like all these 8 C's, right? Just having more of a self-led life. And the energetic core to the past was totally gone. And I did a long therapy line. This is a reference to kind of generational healing work that you can do in IFS. So I have cleaned out most of the debris from my childhood. So it feels like it's like 95% cleared out. So that all feels, it feels like I have a new life. It's like I don't have any of the same old triggers, and I can do all these things I never wanted to do. And I have kind of a self-led life going, which is radically different from where I started. The participants reported similar detrimental effects of coercive control and symptomology, regardless of the type of environment in which they had experienced it. These included symptoms of PTSD, CPTSD, depression, anxiety, dissociation, physical symptoms, and relational difficulties. And the participants had a positive experience of IFS psychotherapy and noted improvements through the reduction of symptoms, overall stress, and fundamental shifts in understanding the perception. And also further research is warranted to this approach. And I also just like to mention here, because we are at a cult conference, that IFS is not the only way. My research revealed pretty amazing results and insights, but there are many different modalities to healing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you for making that point about various therapeutic approaches. But it was really interesting to see your study on IFS, which was the first one of its kind about its use for coercively controlling experiences, and which was very promising. And also the quality of your analysis was excellent, and the themes and the way you explained them. So thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to finish now with some of my own thoughts. So I mentioned that I would talk about the return model, and return stands for reentry therapy, information and referral network. And was the first private practice of mental health professionals trying to help people who had experienced coercive control. And we felt a team approach was really needed because the cases were so complex and we needed to really share our experience and expertise. So I started this in the US with Steve Eichel and Roberta Eisenberg. And in 2004, when I moved to the UK, began working on Return UK with Rod. So, basically, when you're counseling current members or victims or targets of coercion and abuse, we need to provide a safe environment where clients feel in control, and all the ethical codes all stress the value of client autonomy. So we try to help people to reflect on and resolve their own ambivalence, because we know that current members, especially ones that might be talking to you, have some mixed feelings. And we help them to hear their own mixed feelings and to come to a resolution. And to do that, you've got to give them back critical thinking, that which has been denied them. They've probably either not been able to get opposing points of view, or they've been presented, like in an inoculation, with counterposing arguments so they can fight back against the opposing arguments. And we have to help them restore their ability to critically think. And the coercion usually greatly restricts the amount of emotions that you're allowed to express, not at all like the movie. You get out of touch with your feelings. And our goal is to give people a full range of emotional responses as part of what makes our life rich. And so it takes a sensitive approach, and you need specialist knowledge of what it's like to be coercively controlled. But when there is current evidence of abuse, you have to confront it. If there are children in danger, for example, of, let's say, sexual abuse, then you need to protect those children. If you're hearing about old abuse, you don't have to do that. You can just work with the person. But if there is some imminent danger now, you have to deal with that. And then finally, you have to address issues of shame and guilt, which are usually very big issues. Now, let me say something about giving advice. You should only do that when people are actually open to wanting any advice. And so it has to be timed correctly. So if you want to motivate someone to consider leaving a coercively controlling relationship, you don't tell them all the steps they have to take if it's the farthest thing from their mind and just doesn't seem possible. But what you do want to do is try to remove some of the barriers to change and to show them that they have autonomy and can make choices. And then you want to decrease the desirability of unhelpful behaviors, like if they're talking about all the maladaptive behaviors that they have that are keeping them stuck. You want to show them how that's not really working for them. And you need to be empathetic, and you need to give them feedback, help them to clarify their goals. And it's an active approach. Actively help people. And the reason we called Return, we have referral network in there, is that therapists can't do everything. So refer people to legal help, refer people to housing help, social help, support groups, etc. Don't do it all yourself. Don't think that you can. When it comes to helping people that have exited, then you can move on to things like understanding that they've had a very intense experience. In fact, therapy tends to feel boring to people that have come out of coercively controlling relationships. Just sitting, taking your time, slowing down, reflecting. It's all kind of foreign. And to try to understand their relationships, beliefs, values, and practices, and how these have been influenced by the relationship or group that they are exiting. Recognizing that they probably have become psychologically dependent on the group leader and on the members, and working to make sure that they don't become psychologically dependent on you. They can lean on you while they're in therapy, but you're not setting up a long-term thing where they're depending on you. You don't need their adulation. If they say how much you're helping them, you might reflect that they're helping themselves, being humble. This is all really important. Helping them to impair their critical thinking. And in looking at their ambivalent feelings, particularly paying attention to feelings of betrayal and anger about the deception that they experience, which is all correct and real reactions to these things. And those feelings and the depth of them need to be acknowledged without them leading to destructive and self-destructive and other destructive behaviors, which they can do. But if they have the opportunity to process those thoughts and talk them over and to have acceptance of those feelings, then they can move on. Helping people to tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty, one of the great poles of attraction to coercive relationships and groups is that they promise you the answers, they promise to take care of you, they give you meaning and purpose in life, whereas actually those are really difficult things. We have to live with constant uncertainty. That is actually the nature of life. Learning to tolerate that anxiety, learning to prioritize making your own meaning in life, finding your own purpose, and a space to express the full range of emotions, including that existential void that people experience, the angst that they have when they leave, their anger and their grief, as well as them missing the positive things that did exist, at least at one time, probably in the beginning. And so they miss that. Helping them to make decisions, even making decisions about how to wear your hair, what clothes to wear, what to eat, where to live, how to work, who to be with. All of these decisions were probably made for you. So it's hard to make all those decisions, and you can reflect on this with family members and with therapists. And having that balance between giving people choices and overwhelming them with choices. So I always think about how I go to the drugstore and there are just too many shampoos and facial cleaners. I really don't know the difference between them. And, it's like that. Suddenly you have all these choices to make and you don't want people to be overwhelmed. You might help them to simplify some of those choices. Now, in return, we try to suggest strategic communication approaches for therapists and family members that are working with people. And we really like the use of motivational interviewing and motivation enhancement techniques, which grew out of an evidence base for helping alcoholics. So, whereas we used to just put alcoholics in the hot seat and yell at them and confront them about how they were in denial, we found out that didn't really work. Whereas an evidence-based treatment is to help people build on their own motivations, on their own ambivalences, meeting people where they are, building common ground through communication. Where do you agree? What do you agree with this person on? Using paradox or paradoxical intent to develop discrepancies between everything that the relationship, perpetrator, or group promised the person and what's actually happening for them. So your multi-level marketing group told you to be free from financial worries. And are you? So, things, are you really fulfilled? Are you really saving the world? Is your cult leader engaged in illegal behaviors? And is that what you signed up for? Are you doing things that are against the law? Providing a positive pole of attraction. Somehow the alternatives to staying in a relationship have to be positive. And they're not always easily positive. You might have to really help people in concrete ways to have good things to return to. And trying to avoid old or current disputes where possible. You don't have to work out all your conflicts with the person. Rolling with resistance, which is a concept from motivational interviewing. Don't argue with the person. Use the momentum. Try to shift their perceptions. Invite them to have new perspectives, but don't tell them what to think. People used to talk about deprogramming and reprogramming people. We don't look at it that way anymore. It's about helping people to figure things out for themselves, their own future directions and lives. Viewing the person as a valuable resource and finding solutions to their own problems. They know themselves the best when given the opportunity, what they need, what they want, what feels right to them, what doesn't feel right to them. That's all the kinds of things you're trying to restore. and supporting self-efficacy, giving them hope that they can change, that life can be better, that relationships don't have to be like that. And keeping that responsibility for change right on the person by having many alternative approaches of where they can move on with their life. That means you might have to help them with plans where they could live, what they could do, who might be able to support them financially until they get on their feet. Most people come out of groups broke because they've donated all their resources to the group. They come out in debt. They may need some practical help. And then we really advocate for self-care. Take care of yourself, get support. For mental health professionals, self-care is an ethical imperative, not a choice. It's something we're bound to do by our ethical codes. But when it comes to family members who care about the person, they often neglect this area of self-care. So you have to think you only have limited resources and energy. And if you put them all into trying to rescue someone else, then you're not taking care of yourself and other people in the family, other siblings, your spouse, your friends. So you need to keep a balance and not just devote your entire life to helping the identified person about whom there is concern. Then it helps to try to understand, why are they attached to this thing that you can see is destructive? Why can't they see it? So we use the concept of trauma bonds, trauma coerced attachment, and totalistic identity theory to help us have empathy and to understand why people are drawn to their abusers, to understand their loyalty. So there is such a thing as coerced attachment. The person makes you dependent on them. And in totalistic identity theory, which is a theory which Rod and I developed using the data from the Wellspring Resource and Recovery Center, was that what happens is that the perpetrator or the group take over your identity, whereas normally we have multiple identities. We identify with many different parts of ourselves, as we see in IFS therapy, for example. It all gets restricted and constricted to where our whole purpose is to preserve the coercively controlling relationship with the group or with the person. While this is happening, that person, the perpetrator, is actually trying to actively disrupt the attachment of that person to you, to the people that care about them. They want to break up those bonds. They will reinterpret your family as being satanic, abusive, toxic, narcissistic, all sorts of bad words. But the genuine love and caring and attachment of family and friends is more powerful than the pseudo-intimacy and the pseudo-caring that is manifested in the coercively controlling relationship. So you have a lot more power than you may realize. We want to acknowledge the work of Deutschek and Raghavan in developing the concept of trauma bonds to the more accurately defined trauma coerced attachment. A powerful emotional dependency on the abusive partner, a shift in world and self-view that results in having to feel gratitude or loyalty toward the abuser while denying or minimizing the coercion and abuse. And we also want to acknowledge the wonderful work of Dr. Christine Courtois on trauma bonding. Developing a strategic approach to communication requires planning, reflection, patience, and a lot of those things. It means understanding your own emotional response and getting support for that separately. So you can be really angry at the person, but you don't want to express that when you're with them. You want to express your empathy. So you need a place where you can let go of your anger, your fury, your exasperation, your disappointment. And for that, you often need consultation with others. Now, there are some diagnostic errors I see therapists making, and people from what they've learned or read from YouTube or better sources. So just a couple of cautions here. Do not assume that survivors have a psychological disorder, but they often will have psychological consequences, sequelae, symptoms, or threat responses as they've been reframed, to go back to our discourse analysis by the British Psychological Society Power, Threat, and Meaning Framework. So they'll have issues, but don't assume they have a disorder. Don't assume that everyone who's been in a cult or an otherwise coercively controlling relationship has suffered trauma. People's experiences differ. Those who have experienced trauma have not necessarily developed post-traumatic stress disorder, which some people say should be renamed as post-traumatic stress because the symptoms are perfectly normal when you've been exposed to the trauma. Not all perpetrators of coercive control meet the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder or other personality disorders such as antisocial personality disorder. Some of them are pretty normal people that have developed some very bad character flaws and who are acting in horribly abusive ways, but they don't all meet those criteria. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual published by the American Psychiatric Association, the most recent edition being DSM-5-TR 2022, the word cults and brainwashing appear. Though some people say, oh, there is no such thing. Well, there it is. It's called identity disturbance. So they have recognized this in particular in the connection with the type of dissociation where you lose your sense of your own identity. And what causes it? Prolonged and intense coercive persuasion. Coercive persuasion is a term that came from the Cultic studies field that influenced the use of coercive control, which has really become prominent, especially in looking at domestic abuse. These are individuals who have been subjected to intense coercive persuasion, i.e. or e.g. brainwashing, thought reform, indoctrination while captive, torture, long-term political imprisonment, recruitment by sects or cults, there's the C word, or by terror organizations. And what happens to people? They have prolonged changes in or conscious questions of their identity. Now, when it comes to PTSD, the common symptoms for survivors of coercive control is this trio of depression, anxiety, and dissociation. And we're getting this from the Wellspring data and other sources of data. But PTSD can be described as having re-experiencing symptoms like flashbacks, reliving the traumatic event over and over. Your heart is racing, you're sweating, nightmares, frightening thoughts while you are awake. But they're also avoidance symptoms, so you have to stay away from anything that reminds you of it. This is where it does begin to interfere with your life, because you may not want to stay away from all groups. Not all groups are destructive. You may want to have another romantic relationship. They're not all coercive. So you need to confront the avoidance. But because it's so uncomfortable, people are avoiding thoughts or feelings related to the trauma. And then there are the arousal and reactivity symptoms where you're hyper alert, easily on edge, tense, have difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, you're irritable, and you burst out with anger. And then there are the cognitive symptoms. You can't remember key features of the trauma, which will have been protective of you, that dissociation at the time. It has changed your view of yourself and of the world and into a very negative view. You have guilt and blame and other distorted feelings that need to be confronted. What are the beliefs behind them? I am to blame. A loss of interest in enjoyable activities, which is a key sign of depression. And now I'd like to just give a few words about complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, which is commonly cited but often misused not only by the public, by professionals. So this is not in the DSM, but it's in the International Classification of Diseases, version 11, also from 2022. This is published by the World Health Organization. And it says you have to have experienced complex trauma, which is usually prolonged or repetitive events from which escape is difficult or impossible, like in domestic abuse, repeated childhood sexual or physical abuse, and torture, slavery, genocide, etc. But it is the reaction to the trauma that leads to the diagnosis, not just the experiencing of a complex trauma. Some people are misunderstanding that. They think CPTSD means that you had complex trauma, but it's about the psychological reaction. You have to have all the diagnostic requirements for PTSD, which we just went over, the arousal and all those things, the avoidance. And in addition, you have to have 3 additional severe and persistent issues with affect regulation, managing your emotions. You're having beliefs about yourself that are diminished, defeated, or worthless, feelings of shame, guilt, or failure related to the trauma. And you have to have all 3 of these difficulties in sustaining relationships and in feeling close to others. So you have impairment in your personal life, your relationships, at work, or other important areas of functioning. So that's our presentation for today. And we leave you with our contact details because we would be very happy for you to write to us with comments, feedback, things you think we could be doing better, questions, things you may not have understood, things that resonated with you, things that you disagree with, whatever. We would really welcome your input. So thank you so much to Kate, Jennifer, and Ashley. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for listening today.